Advice number 1. Use vigilant care, dear friends, not to overlook those promptings of love and truth which you may feel in your hearts. For these are the tender leadings of the Spirit of God. Nor should any of us resist God's working within us, for it is His redemptive love which strives to show us our darkness and to lead us to true repentance into His marvelous light. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If any man hear my voice and open the door, I will come in to him and will sup with him and he with me. Revelation chapter 3, verse 20. From Ohio Yearly Meetings Book of Discipline.
Okay, this is
Session number 9
of our OIM Greek Bible study. We are reading and discussing the first epistle of John, and we left off in chapter 4, verse 2. Any comments, questions?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
I'm looking at the phrase to test the spirits, and I just wonder if there's any unpacking of this verb to test, or is it pretty straightforward?
This is one of those words I keep on looking up over and over again. It doesn't stick in the head. Okay, takimazo means to make a critical examination of something to determine genuineness, put to the test, to examine, to draw a conclusion about the worth on the basis of testing, to prove, approve.
All of the English translations I look at render it test, T-E-S-T in English, but it's a little bit bewildering to me, and perhaps it shouldn't be. If there's no ambiguity in the Greek, then I'm glad to move on.
The question is the Spirit a real Spirit from the Lord or not, is the question I think that's being asked there. Okay, let me read through verse 6 again. I think we did last week, but we only began to discuss it. Beloved, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. For many false prophets have gone out into the world. By this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. And this is the spirit of the Antichrist, of which you have heard that it is coming, and now it is already in the world. Little children, you are from God and have conquered them, for the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world. They are from the world. Therefore, what they say is from the world, and the world listens to them. We are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us, and whoever is not from God does not listen to us. From this we know the spirit of truth and the spirit of error. We left off in discussing verse 2, and I did a little research on verse 2. We had this word that Jesus Christ having come in the flesh. There's a participle there. We talked about that. And that is the most common word found in most manuscripts. But there are a few, including one major one, Vaticanus, where you have the infinitive to come that confesses Jesus Christ in flesh to come, rather than have come, a participle. In reading about this, it gets very, very confusing, the more in-depth commentaries on it. As I said, most have this word, Jesus Christ having come in flesh. So that's what you usually find, and they give an explanation, at least one explanation given for to say to come instead of having come, that it's better Greek grammar. This is somewhat awkward to say in Greek, Jesus Christ having come in flesh. But there's a different theology surrounding those. As to Jesus Christ having come in the flesh is referring more to his physical body, whereas to come would more refer to the eternal Christ who has always been there, the eternal Messiah. So I don't know what else to say further than, there's a lot of controversy over this verse as to how to understand it and which are the better manuscripts.
The King James has that sentence, every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God. And I think that construction is unusual. We don't usually have that in English to say is come, but what it suggests is that he is present.
Right. That's what I was saying. The eternal Christ, the eternal Messiah that was and is and will be.
But there's also the added thing that the person who is speaking is witnessing Christ is come in his flesh.
This person, the writer?
Anyone, every spirit that confesseth that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is of God.
Right. I think that's much clearer where you get to verse 4. For the one who is in you is greater than the one who is in the world.
Yes.
The one who is in you. This is very clear that we're talking about Christ within. No confusion about that, I think. At least there shouldn't be. That clearly is what the author of the epistle is saying. It appears that these people who seceded, who left the congregation, these antichrists, these anti-Christians, if you recall, the prefix anti can mean opposed to or opposite, but it also can mean instead of. I suspect there's some of that sense here as well, that they're opposed to that kind of understanding maybe. Because John is making it very clear in verse 4 that you have he who is in you to be distinguished from the spirit of evil, Satan, who is in the world.
Yeah, if you talk about the eternal Christ, it can be something out there, something that's not embodied. But when you say Jesus Christ is come in the flesh, it locates Christ within.
That's why I think that's a much stronger statement there.
And also another thing about verse 3, I noticed that when you read verse 3, there wasn't the repetition of verse 2. In the King James, it reads, and every spirit that confesseth not that Jesus Christ is come in the flesh is not of God. So it's a repetition with just stated in a negative.
Well, I'm assuming that there must be something in the manuscript they used there that was in the original Greek that I don't have access to. That's pretty clear. But also this other point you were saying that in older English, as I was saying last time, he is come is the normal way of saying he has come. Just like you say, I am come. In modern English would be I have come. Because this is we are come.
Yeah, I noticed, in Romance languages, the verb to come and to go are auxiliary verbs are being rather than having.
But
English did that then.
Exactly. This is what I was saying last time. In older English, we were just like modern German and other languages, where verbs that involve movement or change of status. We would say, I have become. In older English, you would have said, I am become. You would use this verb be versus have. And that was just normal up through at least the 17th century. I have come, I am become. And you would see this throughout the King James Version. I have become, he is become. So this is just a change in English grammar in the last 300 years.
I'd like your thoughts on the first phrase in verse 2, because I have 5 translations here and they all say something a little bit different. New Revised, by this you know the Spirit of God. Revised English Bible, the way to recognize the Spirit is this. New American Bible, this is how you can know the Spirit of God. The New Jerusalem, this is the proof of the Spirit of God. And Good Speed, you can tell the Spirit of God in this way.
Wow. Okay. I understand what's going on here. We're having a linguistics lesson tonight, I think. It's unfortunate, but I can understand the issue here. I hate to do too much of this because I don't want to keep on losing people, but all right, let's go back there. Okay, this word here is the word that means this, hutos. Hutos means this. This is a form in what's called the dative case. The ending is different. And in this particular case, it has what's called an instrumental function, meaning it's how something is done. So in this way, or like this, or in this, you know. In this, you know. But it's that sense of how you know. In this way, you know. Okay? So that's why you're getting some of those different translations. So here we would translate it in this way, or this is how. It's just hard to explain this simply, but that's why you have all those translations. They're trying to show this is the way, this is the means that you know, okay? And those various translations are trying just in various ways to express this dative case of this word hutos, which means this. And here it means in this way, this is how. Have I explained that well enough, Earl?
Well, what struck me was it seemed like they're using a different verb in this way.
No, it's the same verb, you know.
Well, what I mean is a different meaning. You know, to recognize and to acknowledge. So they're translating you know in a different context.
Well, no, it's this particular verb we've talked about before, which means know. It's one of the verbs that means know, but it also has this sense often of meaning to experience. In this way, this is how you experience the Spirit of God. And then he goes on to say, every spirit that acknowledges Jesus Christ.
Okay.
This is the verb, and the noun is gnosis. We've talked about this, but you get these words over and over again. The noun, knowledge, and then the adjective is gnostikos. So they're all related. Okay? And of course, this word that you translate as confess also means acknowledge. Acknowledges, confesses, it's the same thing. And when you're thinking of Antichrist here, you can also think of anti-Christian. And early friends would use those two words interchangeably, Antichrist, anti-Christian. In verse 4, you have little children, again, students, however you want to translate that. You are from God and have conquered them. You have overcome them. And I think this, to me, also goes back to something in, I believe it's chapter 8 of the Gospel according to John, where Jesus says, I have conquered the world, or I have overcome the world, worldliness. But that sounds somewhat similar to what's being said here to me. You have overcome them. You have won out over them. Because that verb, nike, is the noun, which means victory. And nikao is the verb, to be victorious. We get our sneakers, our gym shoes, Nikes here. That's the word, Nike, Nike in Greek. I think you pronounce that Nike in England. I don't know about Canada. Are they Nikes in Canada?
They are.
Oh, okay. And we've talked about the word world, which means world, earth, worldly people, or all people, worldliness, a number of various kinds of related meanings. Again, in verse 6, we are from God. Whoever knows God listens to us. That word here is the same up above, ginosko, whoever knows God, and perhaps here in the sense of whoever experiences God, has an experience of God, is somehow aware of God more than just academic, a head knowledge kind of God. There's a sense that he has of God that's more than just something that's talked about or read about in books. And so that's why this verb ginosko is so important. You know, of course, in verse 6 also, we have that word aletheia, truth. And often, as I would say here, this is probably truth with a capital T, the spirit of truth. Almost think of that as a synonym for Messiah, a synonym for Son of God, a synonym for Christ, the Spirit of truth. Any questions here about what we've gone through so far today? It's a difficult paragraph here, that's for sure.
Henry, you probably talked about this a lot last week, but I know at least Valerie and I weren't here. But the word spirit and what sort of spirits are being referred to?
What kinds of spirits? Well, all right, you've got the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ on one hand, and then you have the spirit of the world, the spirit of deceit. What's the word? Plane there? Or error? Yeah.
So it says, do not believe every spirit. So does that mean do not believe every person who comes along?
Not person necessarily, but this is the word pneuma, which is spirit, which also means wind and breath. When you're talking physically, you're talking either wind or breath, a current of some sort, invisible physical current. But when you eliminate that outward and you go inward, you're talking about spirit, an invisible current, an invisible flow, an invisible motion or movement. And of course, if it's from God, you have that from God. And then on the other hand, you have the spirit of Satan, the spirit of the devil, the spirit of world in the negative sense of the world, worldliness.
So when it says, do not believe every spirit, for many false prophets have gone out into the world, it would be the spirit that is speaking through that person, through that false prophet?
It could be, or anybody. If I'm speaking at one point, if I'm using, the spirit, that current, that movement of words, that those thoughts and concepts, are they divine or are they devilish? Are they from Satan? That's what you need to discern. That's what you need to test. I don't think I gave that verb at the front very beginning. No, I didn't.
It can be that spirit can also be within us.
Yes.
The lying spirit that is not from God.
Right. That's what I'm saying. You could have either. That's why you need to examine them.
Henry, in the 1611 edition of the King James Version, you'll look at like verse 2, it'll say the Spirit of God, every spirit that confess it. They use a lowercase s for spirit. In the one verse where the Antichrist is mentioned, they said, in every spirit that confesses not that Jesus Christ, they capitalized it there. And then they say, this is that spirit, which is italicized, of Antichrist. So most of the cases, it's lowercase, but in one case, they use it as uppercase.
Oh,
and I didn't know if there was any significance in the translators of that edition.
Well, no, if you have the original edition, capitalization is nothing like today. How can I put this? Pretty erratic. Of course, in the original Greek, there was no capitalization. The only letters that existed in the alphabet were all capital letters. And for several hundred years more, that you eventually got to have small letters that were created. Everything was capitalized in the original Greek of the New Testament. There was no punctuation whatsoever. No commas, no periods, no question marks, no quotation marks, no capitalization, nothing. So when we capitalize something like truth, I or an editor in English is making a decision as to the meaning of that word, that it probably should be capitalized. Earlier friends, before the 20th century, they often would not capitalize words that in modern English we would capitalize. Like if you read journals from the 19th, 18th centuries, you'll find words like Christian that are consistently spelled with a small c, not a capital C. And that was just a convention of their time. Today, I think I try to be consistent that if I think there's something greater than just the average or neutral meaning of the word, and I will then capitalize the first letter, like in truth or spirit. But sometimes it's hard to know, it could be both. But remember, in the original, there was no distinction made.
Yeah. And I think the other thing going through my mind is, and this is where I've heard people from different faith traditions speak, Henry, is, like you mentioned in spirit there, that can mean anything that's anti-Christian or not Christian. But also, I sometimes hear the word spirit when it's associated with the Antichrist is a unique spirit or presence, not just something that is part of the world in terms of approach, but actually almost like an entity.
Okay, that's, now we're talking about later interpretations, okay?
Yeah.
And so often people talk about Antichrist and the word Antichrist as if it's referring to some of the things that are written about in the book of Revelation. The word does not occur in the book of Revelation, period. And here, these antichrists, these people who left the congregation of John, I'm assuming they still would call themselves Christian, but they rejected the beliefs of the rest of John's congregation. And that's why John's saying they're anti-Christian, anti-Christ. They're not following the correct understanding, the correct revelation of what Christ means and what Christ is. What he's saying, George, is very true about what's out there, but there's so much out there about antichrist and anti-Christian and how it's been used over the past several centuries that has nothing to do with the original sense here.
Thank thee, Henry, very much. This was very helpful.
It's messy because you just have to deal with people believing all sorts of things that have nothing to do with first century Christianity. I could call everybody, lots of people, antichrists if I wanted to, in the sense that was used here. But it means anti-Christian, but it's anti the correct understanding, the correct revelation of Christ, of the Messiah, of the Son of God, that inward divine spirit that is in us as a seed, potentially something that can grow and bring us to God. I'd like to look up one word here, the very last word, the spirit of truth and the spirit of, my translation says error. I think that's also deceit. Does anyone have that translation?
Mine is falsehood.
Falsehood, okay. Lie, maybe.
Mine says that is how we know the spirit that is true and the spirit that is false.
Yeah.
New Jerusalem is the spirit of falsehood.
Yeah. Okay, it means wandering from the path of truth. Error, delusion, deceit, deception. So the spirit of deception, the spirit of delusion, a deluding spirit.
Those last couple of words seem to carry a pretty strong negative connotation that is more deliberate. Whereas error can sound like, well, you just made a mistake. You just didn't get it. But it's a little more insidious when you translate it as delusion, or what was the other one?
Deceit, deception, error.
Deceit.
I think it is stronger, though.
Even though all of the English translations in front of me render it as error. But error, it's sort of like when people say, well, sin, that's just missing the mark, rather than something that participates in evil. I have a quip with those who can't see that it's a negative part of the moral universe rather than just ignorance.
I think he's being strong here, though. Let me look at the verb. No, that was the noun I just gave you, this wandering from the path of truth. Let me just see if it says anything else here. Roaming, wandering, of an erroneous view of God as exhibited in polytheism, resulting in moral degradation. It's pretty strong. For gain, they have wholly given themselves up to Balaam's error. I think it's fairly strong. And the verb here says, planao is to mislead, to deceive, to lead astray. And that's the verb. So it is strong.
Could you explain verse 6, where it says, whoever knows God listens to us, and whoever is not from God does not listen to us? So it seems like a person has to be from God in order to...
Okay. Think of that as saying we belong to God and they belong to the world. From, well, it's a preposition ek, which means out of or from. I've read that this probably means in the sense of, we belong to God, they don't.
So those people are not from God in that they don't have the Spirit of Christ working through them in a way that allows
They're
them...
rejecting it.
My translation says, he who is not of God.
Yeah, there's actually a preposition there, ek, to, and the ek means out of or from. So out of God. That TOU is just the article the, because as I mentioned last week, you can use this article the before names of people like the Jesus, the Peter, the Paul, the Henry, the Michael, and also abstract concepts like God, the God, out of the God, literally, or from God. Okay, anything else?
Well, I was just thinking about that same sentence because sometimes I think I'll be talking to somebody and maybe it'll get heated or they're not really listening to me or they're not able to hear what I'm saying. But I also feel like a lot of the time it's because of a fault on my end and that I wasn't really speaking in that.
I think, David, what's being said here or understood is being born of God. Those who are born of God, the way you would say of God is this expression, ek tu theu. He was born of God. He was given birth to by God is what is understood here. So you just have this verb to be given birth to, the second birth, being born again, a second birth. That's what's understood here when you're using this expression.
I guess I was just thinking like I've and I'm thinking kind of the example I would use is some of the trouble that I had at my local Quaker meeting, which is very liberal, but I also really loved the people there. And just having different experiences there where I kind of get upset at people but I've had other experiences where I was like, I was able to kind of let go of some of my and I was able to kind of hear what Jesus was asking of me. And then I could see all sorts of possibilities open up. But there's been other times where I was perhaps approaching these situations in kind of a bad spirit, I would say, or like some kind of spirit that was whipping up around me or inside me. And so I guess I was just thinking like, if somebody's not listening to me, it might not be them, it could be because I need to ask for Jesus' help. So I guess I was just looking at this and I was thinking, well, if somebody wasn't listening to me, I wouldn't necessarily jump to, they're in some kind of bad spirit. But I might also ask, like, well, maybe I'm also in a bad spirit right now and kind of maybe try a different way. I was just kind of thinking about that because I could see how, I kind of see the negative part of this passage and thinking how somebody could misinterpret it in kind of a bad way. If somebody doesn't agree with them,
yeah, I think there's a lot here that can easily be misinterpreted. And again, poor translations don't help, as well as misinterpretations of the translations. And again, just this past paragraph is really not an easy one at all to talk about or even to translate initially. I think we also have to think that the group, the congregation, the house church or house churches that John is talking about, and those who left those house churches, these early Christian house churches, my feeling is at least those who remained were really in a very powerful spiritual state individually. These were saints. These people were really completely focused on God, on Christ, in a way that I think maybe put some of us to shame. But I also think of early friends being in the same state of awareness of God and obedience to the will of God and being righteous in the way that we all are meant to be. But this is a problem I often see elsewhere in Bible studies too, where people are comparing themselves to what they're reading in the New Testament. And I think they don't realize the differences between the state of the churches then, or even like the state of the Quaker congregations, the Quaker meetings in the first generations of Quakers. They can put us all to shame as to they were willing to suffer and die for their faith, to be living sacrifices for Christ, to be true witnesses. And if you remember the word witness in Greek, anyone, I don't know, maybe I've not talked about this here. The Greek word for witness?
Martyr.
Martyr. That's the Greek word that means witness. Like someone who witnesses something, they see something. And that gives us our English word martyr, because a martyr was someone who witnessed for the truth of God, for Christ, and would die and sacrifice their lives in that witness. They were absolutely devoted and believed, and you couldn't change them. So this Greek word for witness began to also mean martyr in the sense that we think of martyr today.
So the true senses of martyr, to see something, of witness, to see something or to describe what one has seen.
Well, witness is that you are proclaiming and an exemplar or not exemplar. I'm sorry, I'm just blanking out on choice of vocabulary here. Here, I do have this dictionary. Let's see how they translate it. Well, like the verb martyreo means to confirm or attest something on the basis of personal knowledge or belief, to bear witness, to be a witness.
It sounds like a judicial term as contrasted
It
to
also is, yes.
hearsay.
I'm sort of focusing on the
Yeah,
fact that
here it is. This is this word
Word error.
So let me give the dictionary translation of this word. Martus or martyros means one who testifies in legal matters, a witness. 2, one who affirms or attests, a testifier, a witness. 3, one who witnesses at cost of life, a martyr.
I was sort of focusing on the fact that this person had seen something, had really seen something that mattered.
Or experience something, not necessarily just see, okay? And the verb to confirm or attest something on the basis of personal knowledge or belief.
So that would seem to be a very significant word for the early friends and for us.
Yes. They would use the word witness, I think, at least most often as far as I can recall. Is there any other word there, Pat? I think witness is the one you usually see.
Just the words bear testimony to is a phrase that comes to mind.
Yeah, bear testimony and witness. Okay, well, we didn't get very far tonight, but this paragraph was very important and very difficult to kind of go through. But I hope everyone got something out of it. And there's much more, I'm sure, that could be said. And of course, if you look at commentaries, you'll find quite a variety and varied commentaries on all this, saying sometimes very different things. I'm trying to give what I see from the original Greek, as well as just my sense of it as to a traditional and early Quaker understanding of it. So both the early grammatical aspect as well as how I think we should understand it.
I found this passage to be very beautiful.
Yeah. And just listening to all your translations, there seems to be a lot of variety in the especially in the translations here. That kind of scares me a bit. But you have to try to go beyond the words if you can. You know, I always say that most English-speaking biblical scholars like the New Revised Standard Version, and some even more the older Revised Standard Version with plain language, and I do too. But at the same time, knowing that there are errors and mistranslations in both those, but my sense is there are fewer there than in some other translations that are current. And of course, the King James translation was a good translation for its time, but it wasn't always based on the best manuscripts. And where there were errors in translation, as friends understood it, they pointed out those errors, those who knew the original Greek.
What are your thoughts about the New English Bible?
I'm not too fond of it. I used it years ago for a while. Actually, that was before I really started looking at the Greek. I originally majored in classical languages, Latin and Greek, and then switched over to Slavic languages, Russian and Polish and whatnot. But this is a whole other topic of translations. Some translators are more literal, some are less literal. But the real problem so often is what philosophical and religious background are they coming from? So they have presuppositions as to how certain things should get translated. And that is a real problem because all these translators get their salaries paid by some church or other, and they might not like some of the translations. And even like I was saying with the Revised Standard Version and the New Revised Standard Version, sometimes they'll translate it one way in the English, but then in a note, they'll say in the note, the Greek says X, Y, or Z, because they just know it, what it really says. And yet for whoever's paying their salary, you've got to translate it another way. At least they're honest that way, that I don't see in other translations often. You know, there's some 24 translations in English out there right now, I believe, perhaps even more. And occasionally I look at them too. And well, I always have to look at the King James Version to see what early friends said. And they also use the Geneva Bible. Some people aren't aware of that, the Geneva and the Bishop's Bible. And I've seen some comments on George Fox using the Geneva translation of parts of the first chapter of John. And they're commenting and making all sorts of wild comments on his use of that translation, which is probably what he had with him in prison at that time, without realizing that he's just using a different translation from the King James. The commentator didn't know that.
I usually use the King James, and even though it may have had some mistakes in it, I find that just the way rhetoric is used conveys a meaning. For example, in verse 6, the way the first part of it reads, "We are of God, he that knoweth God heareth us, he that is not of God heareth not us." That repetition, first in the positive form, then in the negative form, what that does, it just underscores the fact that there are two distinct, separate ways of being. You don't get that when you have a language that's more prosaic rather than poetic. The poetry really helps with the meaning.
Mm-hmm. You see, the Epistles of John by Raymond E. Brown, he was the greatest biblical scholar in the 20th century on the works of John. This is just some 800 pages on the three epistles. There are two more volumes on the Gospel according to John. But what he does with what Pat just mentioned, he breaks up in his translation these couplets, those of God versus those who aren't. And it's nice to see the translation broken up that way rather than all in one paragraph. If you see it all in one paragraph, you don't realize this either or kind of situation that Pat's pointing out to. Again, I wish a translator would do that. Sometimes the New Jerusalem Bible will do that. I don't have it right next to me at the moment, but I would check on that, see maybe if they did it here. Probably not, because it's only these 3 or so couplets, but it helps us, I think, to see it if it's presented visually that way. If you recall, I gave this format that's presented there of how you break up the epistle in the New Jerusalem Bible. When I send out the notes tonight or tomorrow, you'll see it again. And I think they're very sharp about that sort of thing, breaking things up. And it just is so much easier to visualize it and to understand the whole thing. Because one very important thing is to remember, when these were written, there were no chapter headings, no chapter numbers, no verse numbers. This was just one whole script, one long word for the whole epistle, no spaces, nothing. So how you break it down into chapters and verses came hundreds and hundreds of years later. And it's all someone else deciding to do it that way. Occasionally, maybe not the right way, but that's all much later. It makes it a lot easier for us to find a verse rather than someone in the 4th century. Well, it's probably about 1/5 the way through this manuscript. Any last questions? Yeah, go ahead, David.
I'm fascinated with this first phrase in verse 6, and several translations, I think both the King James and the Revised Standard, have a preposition of. We are of God. Some others have from God. And then I'm seeing at least 2 say belong to God, and Goodspeed says we are children of God. It's sort of taking a literary license, moving from preposition to something more of a verb phrase.
Yeah, that's what they're doing. But this is the verb. This is the phrase here. It's this preposition ek, ek. And again, the sense is, born of God. That's the understanding there. We are of God. We exist because of our relationship of belonging to God now. We are God's children. We are.
Right.
But it's that ek, the ek there. It doesn't mean of, unless you want to say born of God. Okay, well, good night, everyone.
Good night.
Thank you, Henry. Thanks, friends. Wonderful evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
This podcast has been a production of Ohio Yearly Meeting. It was hosted by Henry Jason and edited by Kim Palmer. The introduction and credits were read by Chip Thomas. The quote in our introduction is from the Queries and Advices section of Ohio Yearly Meeting's Book of Discipline. A link to that book can be found in the show notes to this episode. We welcome feedback on this or any of our podcast episodes. Contact us through our website, ohioyearlymeeting.org, or email us at oimconservative@gmail.com.